Thank you so much for attending this evening's talk. We're thrilled to have an opportunity to gather in person for tonight's incredible event with the 19th Director of the U.S. National Park Service. I'm Robert Rose, Executive Director of the Institute for Integrative Conservation at William & Mary. The IIC launched in 2020 with a mission of cultivating an inclusive community of creative thought leaders to deliver timely and innovative solutions to the world's most pressing conservation challenges. Tonight's event caps off the IIC Conservation series, which is focused on Indigenous voices in conservation. In a moment, I want to introduce our invited guests and moderators, but I first wanted to say a few words about the U.S. National Park System in order to frame this evening's discussion. Following the protection of Yellowstone National Park in 1872, the collection of protected places has grown to over 85 million acres and protects a broad range of critical ecosystems from the mountains and landscapes of Denali National Park to the coral reefs of the National Park of American Samoa. The National Park System preserves some of the most iconic and beautiful natural places on Earth. And beyond protecting these natural areas, the U.S. Park System has connected countless numbers of people from around the globe to the beauty of the natural world. I know for me, there is no place I feel more connected to nature than when I'm hiking the eastern high country of Yosemite National Park. But we should also recognize that the U.S. National Park System has a complex and challenging history where strict protection often came at the expense of the original inhabitants of those locations while becoming a natural playground for only the wealthiest among us. With Director Sam's appointment as the first Native American director of the National Park Service, the U.S. moves towards a more integrated approach of conservation where management and planning brings together a diverse range of voices and stakeholders and can be seen as one of the first steps towards reconciliation in the U.S.'s relationship with nature and with the Native American nations that were and remain stewards of their ancestral homelands. The Institute for Integrative Conservation wants to help amplify and accelerate approaches that facilitate local and indigenous-led initiatives around conservation in the U.S. and around the globe. We are excited to hear the wisdom of Director Sams and hope there are positive paths forward where we can all experience the beauty of U.S. national parks while also supporting indigenous communities and enhancing their opportunities and well-being. This event this evening is brought to you by the Institute for Integrative Conservation, the National Park Service, with support for the Indigenous Voices in Conservation Speaker Series from the William & Mary Center for Racial and Social Justice, American Indian Resource Center, American Indian Students Association, Native Studies Minor, the Environment and Sustainability Program, and Departments of History and Anthropology. Tonight's program will be about 45 to 50 minutes, followed by 20 minutes of questions from the audience. For those of you in the live audience, you should have received a note card, and if you have questions, please write them down and pass them to the center aisles. At about 7 o'clock, people will come along and pick those up, and then a few students will be asking those questions. For those of you Zooming in, please submit your questions through the webinar Q&A function. And as a reminder, please silence your cell phones if you haven't already done that. William & Mary acknowledges the indigenous peoples who were the original inhabitants of the lands our campus is on today. The Cherahaka Nottoway, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Potawatomi, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respects to their tribal members, past and present. We would also like to recognize that in attendance today, we have Rappahannock Indian Tribe Chief G. Ann Richardson, Nansemond Indian Nation Chief Keith Anderson, Upper Mattaponi Indian Chief W. Frank Adams. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. So now I want to introduce our moderators and this evening's guest. We are joined tonight by Nikki Bass and Andrew Fisher as moderators. Nikki Bass is a Nansemond Indian scientist focused on cultural revitalization through environmental stewardship. She was born and raised on the Chesapeake Bay and has 15 years of experience in environmental protection and public health. Nikki weaves traditional and modern Indigenous perspectives into interdisciplinary projects that immerse communities in living tribal landscapes and waterways. Over the past decade, she has dedicated her efforts to the Great Dismal Swamp as a site of intertribal significance and the Nansemond River as the original life force of the Nansemond people. She currently works to empower her tribe through data collection, storytelling with geographic information systems, and capacity building through conservation partnerships. And for those wondering, I didn't ask her to say anything about geographic information systems. She did that on her own. Andrew Fisher is an associate professor of history at William & Mary and currently directs the Environment and Sustainability program. He received his BA from the University of Oregon and PhD from Arizona State University. His research and teaching interests focus on modern Native American history, environmental history, and the American West. His first book is Shadow Tribe, The Making of Columbia River Indian Identity. And his current project is a biography of the Yakima actor, technical advisor, and activist Nepo Stronghart. And now, I'm incredibly honored to introduce to you the 19th Director of the United States National Park Service, Charles F. Sams III. Director Sams is Cayuse and Walla Walla and is an enrolled member of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Northeast Oregon, where he grew up. He also has blood ties to the Cocopah tribe and the Yankton Sioux of Fort Peck. Director Sams most recently served as Oregon Governor Kate Brown's appointee to the Pacific Northwest Power and Conservation Council, where he held a position as council member from March to December of 2021. Prior to joining the Northwest Council, he served as executive director for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. For more than 25 years, Director Sams has worked in tribal and state government and in the nonprofit natural resource and conservation management field, with an emphasis on the responsibility of strong stewardship for land preservation for this and future generations. Director Sams is a veteran of the U.S. Navy, where he served as an intelligence specialist. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from Concordia University and a Master of Legal Studies in Indigenous Peoples Law from the University of Oklahoma School of Law. He lives with his wife, Lori Lynn Reineke Sams, and their youngest daughter in Alexandria, Virginia. So please help me welcome our two moderators and Director Sams. Thank you. And this is really meant to be a conversation, so I'm going to turn it over to Nikki Bass, who will start the questions.
Yes, so Wingapo, welcome. I'd like to personally say what an honor it is to speak with you this evening. And we thought we'd get started off by asking if you could tell us about your professional career path in conservation.
Well, good evening, my friends and relatives. My Indian name is Mockingbird with Big Heart, which I received from my late grandfather, Pedro Jim, headman of the Cocopah people. When I was born, shortly after I was born, he picked me up, and of course, like any baby, I just screamed at him. And he then took his ear and he put it up against my chest, and he could hear my heartbeat. And from there, he said, "I'm naming you Mockingbird with Big Heart, for you will go out into the world. You will learn those things best that you can take from other people. Bring those gifts home to teach your people. Leave bad where you found it. And you must have a big heart to take those things that are good and bad in and be able to filter those things out." And so I would say my journey on doing conservation work begins with my naming. Iwai Kanashnaknui Thluma is I am a keeper of the salmon. I am from the Pacific Northwest of the Plateau Tribes, who have a very strong responsibility in stewarding our resources. And I come from the place of the Big Springs on the Umatilla Indian Reservation. When we were stood up as humans, as I understand my own creation story from the Cayuse and Walla Walla people, is that Coyote was asked to come to the mountain, which is now called Mount Adams. And when he got to the top, the Creator had said to him, "I want you to go down to the other people, and this thing called human will be created, but I want to see what gifts they can provide." Now, there's no snow. We're finally into the late part of spring, almost to summer, so I can't tell a traditional story because there's no more snow on the mountain. so I will have to just paraphrase. So Coyote makes his way down the mountain, and he sees an eagle, and he tells Eagle this thing called human was coming. And Eagle says, I will give part of my eyesight so this thing called human will be able to see. As he goes down and glissades down the mountain, he finally gets to the break of the trees. He looks into the trees, and he yells out, Owl, Owl, this thing called human is coming. What gift can you provide? Owl provides part of hearing to this thing called human. All of the different species provided different parts. I get my veins from the roots of the plant people. I get my voice, though, from the salmon, because salmon was the last to give, and he gave two things. He gave of his voice completely so that we would have a common language, and among the plateau tribes, it's called the Chinook jargon. So whether you live at the mouth of the Columbia River or you live up on high on the plateau, we have one common language that we can use as a trade language. And then second, he gave of his body. But before he gave up of all of those things, he asked that we keep a covenant with our Creator, which were to be the keepers of those things who cannot speak for themselves. So as a human being, my responsibility is to ensure that I protect those natural resources so that they will return year after year after year. And fortunately for me, in my travels across the United States, in talking with different tribes and in visiting with indigenous people overseas, I hear this very same refrain around stewardship. So, of course, my career didn't start that way. Well, technically it did. So back in my early days, I started off with the Oregon Youth Conservation Corps, working and building trail and doing fire suppression before I went into the service. And so I had gotten my taste into doing conservation and natural resource work. And then when I got into the service, I was an intelligence specialist, originally a Soviet analyst, trained in Middle Eastern affairs, and left on the China desk with the Defense Intelligence Agency. But one of my side duties was to be the environmental protection officer for my squadron. Not because I had a bunch of natural resource background, but because I could do technical writing. And so that allowed me to at least understand and continue on understanding how to be able to give back. How do we protect those things that can protect themselves? How was fuel being dropped by our airplanes by accident? How could we remediate that to ensure that our environment was safer than when we found it? After I left the service, I wanted to go into natural resource work, and I returned home to work for my tribe in the natural resource department. And one of my first jobs was looking and helping declassify information at Hanford Nuclear Reservation and figuring out, hey, cesium and tritium was leaking into the groundwater system that was affecting our salmon on the Columbia River. And that caught me on to understanding that I needed to work with more young people to help provide them the skills and the understanding of how they have that same responsibility. And so for the next decade, I worked with tribes, my own home tribe, the Warm Spring tribe, the Yakima tribe, several tribes in the Puget Sound, the Shoshone-Bannock, in working with youth ages 18 to 25 to do salmon and watershed restoration. And in between there, I got a degree and then decided to move to New York and set up the first AmeriCorps programs, and eventually came back running a number of natural resource organizations, really centered on the idea that conservation is not really about taking something away as it is for preserving for future generations, 7 generations down the road.
So fascinating, and actually you've touched on a lot of the questions I had related to your path, just ways that you've woven traditional knowledge from your community into your work and the mission. We were also wondering, were there any particular moments of challenge that you had to overcome or opportunities that you felt were significant turning points for you?
You know, this work, the dawn, well, a couple different things. Conservation, when you look at conservation and the founding fathers of conservation, Teddy Roosevelt, John Muir, so many others, it really came from a separatist and racist past. It was removing Indians off the landscape and saying that you're protecting wild places. Now, in my travels across Indian country, I've not found a word for wild. Among my own language, even in this Chinook jargon, the closest I can get to the word wild is a word called skookum. And skookum really doesn't mean wild, it just means not straight, so crooked. But even then, that's not a description of the land. As you travel across Indian country, everything somebody else calls wild, we call home. We have a word for home. That is our home. It provides everything we need, not to just survive, but to thrive as a people. And so, figuring out how to overcome the barriers that I had seen. I was born in 1970 as the movement finally started to come forward about having to clean up the planet. And yet, through those years, I didn't really see myself even though I knew I had a responsibility based on my cultural upbringing, my traditional upbringing. But throughout my career, it was very rare to see other people of color in natural resource management. If I didn't have strong mentors who were both Native, non-Native, and other people of color, I probably would have given up. In 2000, at age 30, I became the Earth Conservation Corps' president, and my board chair was Ethel Kennedy, which I felt very fortunate to have. And Mrs. Kennedy decided that she wanted to do basically a coming out party. So we had National Geographic, and were able to go into the Hubble room and invite every major conservation environmental organization in Washington, D.C. for a luncheon. When I got up there to introduce myself, I looked out, and I didn't see any other people of color. The only other people of color I saw in that entire room were the people who were serving us lunch. And so I went back home a little disheartened in Portland of figuring out how can we do better? What can we do? So we started an organization, Environmental Professionals of Color, to actually start reaching out to people who were early in their career, mid-career, and other people who were people of color and their senior members, and start networking in Portland. There are now chapters all across the United States, in Washington, D.C., and San Francisco, and Denver, because we wanted to ensure that there was a safety net for people of color who wanted to do this work and find ways that they could advance in their leadership skills.
Amazing. I love your example about how language reflects our values, and one example for here is that my path has not been linear at all, and I look at our tidal marshes and how they wind and curve, and I think that, you know, for a lot of us on a leadership journey, we have to be open to the same type of navigation to reach our goals.
Absolutely. I feel very fortunate, again, having a number of mentors. Anton Minthorn, who was one of our general council chairman, our tribal elder, is like an older great uncle to me, who has told me to take jobs from time to time, sometimes jobs I didn't want to take. By example, I think Annie knows, I had no interest in going to work for the Trust for Public Land because I'd been taking care of a piece of property that the trust had bought and transferred, but they didn't take all the money off the table. So then I was the fundraiser to try to do all the restoration on the work. So while I appreciated that they conserved the land through acquisition, there really was no long-term thought about how to preserve that land by making sure that it was endowed. But Anton said, well, you can't make change from the outside throwing rocks at them. So I joined the staff to be the National Tribal and Native Lands Program, and talking about when we did transactional work, it's not about transactional, it's about transformational. And therefore, the only way to make that transformational is to make sure that we leave money on the table to bring the community groups together who will be charged with preserving those lands and enhancing those properties, or else they won't be protected in the future. There will be development. So Anton was a huge influence on my life. Of course, my grandfather, the late Charles F. Sams, my father, the late Charles F. Sams Jr., but I had a number of tribal elders who were extremely influential, and a number of non-Native. Today I learned Admiral Zlatiper had passed away. Admiral Zlatiper was my commander of my battle group during the first Gulf War, and he has been very influential over the last nearly 30 years of my life. When I was nominated, I reached out to him, and he offered very good counsel and guidance about what leadership is, and reminding me that it's always about people. Leadership is about people. It's not about things. It's not about stuff. It's about people. And if you take care of your people, they will take care of those things that need to be done.
That's right. Wonderful insights. Well, with that, I'll pass it over to Andy for our next set of questions.
I was going to ask a follow-up.
Oh, sure.
Sure. Is this mic working too? You had mentioned that when you started working in conservation, you didn't see people of color in leadership roles. I'm also curious, we see the same issues with just access to nature and access to green places, that it tends to, we don't see a lot of access for people of color. And so either in the National Park Service or through other mechanisms, how does that begin to turn? How do we begin to think about providing more access to natural areas, to hikes, to green space for people of color, people that haven't traditionally taken advantage of those places?
You know, it's meeting people where they're at. And if they're not in the park, then we need to go out into those communities where they're at. If they're not in our gateway communities, we go into the urban areas. We go into other rural areas, and we have real conversations with them. Not everybody recreates the exact same way. Not everybody wants to do backpacking. Not everybody wants to do water skiing. That's perfectly fine, but we're not asking, how do you value the park? What values do you want to bring into the park? What do you want to share with the park? And how can we transform our parks to meet the needs of the future of such a diverse society? We're starting to have those conversations, and I'm hoping one of my priorities is to ensure that our staff are going out and talking to different folks so that we can see that, so that they see a reflection of themselves in the park. That way they will continue to come in, and also they will continue to preserve and protect those things that we love. But we have to have those conversations. For many tribal folks, as we're doing, looking at co-stewardship, our parks are starting to recognize, and the staff, that the tribes just don't want access to the park. They want to ensure that they're also continuing on resource development, ensuring that we're using fire as a traditional way of bringing back other nutrients into the ground, and traditional to get rid of invasive plants to ensure that native plants are much stronger and that there is use for medicinal and for food and protection of the animals. That's a different relationship than just recreating in a national park. And not every park can accommodate that, but so many of our large icon parks can be able to work with tribes to figure that out.
Thank you. Just want to say that as a fellow Northwest boy, it's nice to have someone else here who knows and cares about salmon as something other than on a bagel. But, I wanted to expand on that point you just made about working with local communities. A key principle of the 30 by 30 conservation goal includes supporting locally led and locally designed conservation efforts, and also honoring tribal sovereignty and supporting the priorities of tribal nations. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on how treaty rights, for the CTUIR and other Native nations and tribal sovereignty have shaped your work on behalf of conservation.
I'll start with sovereignty. And sovereignty, as I understand it, and was taught to me by my grandfathers and by my elders, resides in you as the individual, that when we were created and stood up as humans, that your individual sovereignty could not be impaired by another person. That is to say that you're truly a free person. It doesn't come without responsibilities, because free will comes with a lot of responsibilities. But my grandfather would say, before the non-Indians came here, think how free we once were, that you could live within a clan, but if you disagreed with that clan for whatever reason, you could take you, your family, and people who agreed with you and move on to another. There was so much space within our land that you could set up your own tribe. You could be your own people, and you could worship and practice your traditions and cultures in your own way. That was true freedom, but you were sharing your sovereignty in order to build your own republic. And it's not different. We as Americans share our sovereignty. And I think that understanding what that truly means is that there is a symbiotic relationship between the federal government and tribal governments. Now, understanding that tribes who have predated the existence of the United States have been here, says they understand it, since time began, or time immemorial, or at least for 15,000 years. So that makes them over 1,000 generations here on this landscape. And the United States is still a young government and can learn by being able to now talk with tribes about traditional ecological knowledge while fulfilling their obligations and commitments to the tribes, either under treaty or executive order. This way, we're respecting tribes and their sovereignty. President Biden, Secretary Haaland have made it very clear that we're going to take an all-government approach on this, that we are going to ensure that we respect the rights of tribes, that we are going to consult with them on a government-to-government basis. We are going to want to figure out how we can incorporate traditional ecological knowledge into the practices that we do out there, because science is all about observation. And if you've been here for 1,000 generations, we have some observations we'd like to make, and we'd like to share with the other science community, because traditional ecological knowledge is science-based. It's no different than using good, sound science. But being able to bring that and marry it with Western science, I think could be a very powerful moment for us as we figure out how to have more climate resiliency and combat climate change.
And you worked for a time with Salmon Core?
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
And how that connects to traditional ecological knowledge and tribal youth?
So from 1995 until 2003, I'd come home. Salmon Core had only been around for a couple years, and it worked with tribal Native youth, 18 to 25 years old, who were categorized as at risk for whatever reason. And I would tell them the only thing you're at risk of is success. You're not at risk of failure. We already got that. What you're at risk of success, and success is a lot harder many times to deal with because you haven't been given the tools on how to deal with that. And what we know is our salmon runs had dropped precipitously. We went from 16 million salmon returning on average every year to the Columbia River to at times less than 1 million. If we were going to fulfill our obligation as Waikaneshnaknuithluma, the keepers of the salmon, we needed these young people to work with our elders who held that traditional ecological knowledge on how we could go and repair the landscape. How could we work on riparian areas to ensure that we could put in shaded trees to cool the flow of the water? How could we ensure that the river was clean enough and that the water quality was there so that the salmon would come back and be able to spawn in their redds so that they could come and repeat themselves over and over again? Over that time period, we trained over 800 young people to become stewards, better stewards. And not all of them went into natural resources, but a good portion of them did. And even those that didn't go into natural resources, and I'm very fortunate to see them now, all these years later, in very senior leadership roles, some of them on their tribal councils, they have a better understanding that we are a natural resource-based economy people, and that their stewardship and responsibilities is to ensure that they do no harm as they're doing their economic development, and being able to marry that together. So Salmon Core was highly successful in being able to train a generation of new stewards. I was sad to say that it went away. We're hoping that it'll come back. The administration is very strong on an Indian Youth Conservation Corps movement that we're putting out there, and youth corps in general. Over the last 4 years, we've invested $40 million towards that end, so that not only are we working with tribal nations who are doing their own youth corps movement, we're working with youth corps across the United States to teach them that value of stewardship and the importance of being able to steward those things. You know, when I worked in New York in the early 90s, I got fortunate enough, for whatever reason, to sit on an educational reform committee with New York City Department of Education. And it was looking at textbooks and different meanings. And what they did do is they brought in a number of members of the clergy. And so one night during dinner, we recessed for dinner. I got to sit with a Catholic priest, a Methodist minister, a rabbi, an imam, and myself, and we were just talking about different portions of creation stories. And what fascinated me the most was when the rabbi said, you know, in Genesis, it's not dominion. In the old Aramaic and Hebrew, the word is actually stewardship. Imagine what Judeo-Christian life would look like if we had not used the word dominion in Genesis and had actually used stewardship. That has stuck with me for 30 years now, trying to figure out how do we change, how do we use language and words so that we, as the Americans, understand we are just the leasee of these lands that we call home because we must protect it for the next 7 generations down. That we must leave what we have and that we found better than when we left it. We have to leave it much better. And I've always been, struck me as very interesting that the difference of how one word can be changed.
Yeah, things get lost in translation. It's a challenging time for salmon and many other species, including us. It's also an exciting time, though, because we have our first Native Director of the National Park Service, also our first Native Secretary of the Interior, and that's opened up some new possibilities. So I wanted to ask you about, the Biden-Harris administration's America the Beautiful campaign to pursue a nationwide effort to conserve, connect, and restore lands, waters, and wildlife. What do you see as the role of the national parks in advancing the goals of that campaign and the 30 by 30 benchmark?
We are so very fortunate with the Great American Outdoors Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, bills passing, and the final permanently funding the Land and Water Conservation Fund, to over $900 million a year. But we are now transitioning our thought process through from government that just gives grants is really to look at it through a more philanthropic lens. How can we ensure this money gets out into the field and gets to the people who are doing the work on the ground? We have a chance to invest in lands with local governments, with communities and nonprofit organizations to put additional land into conservation voluntarily. Of course, we're only working with voluntary sellers, so that could very much help the capacity across the nation of being able to meet that 30 by 30 goal with 30% of our lands in some type of conservation hold. Now, land and water conservation funds aren't currently available to tribes, And so we are working to figure out how we can get that changed with Congress so tribes can apply directly. Because tribes control over 56 million acres of land in the United States. If you look at their land base, over 90% of that land is already in some type of conservation hold. 5% of it is used for social development, housing, other forms of medical facilities, infrastructure, and then maybe 5% at the most is used for some type of economic gain. And so that really shows that they really spend most of their time on a conservation and a natural resource economy-based system. And so I think that tribes who already have those lands, being able to expand it and work with local communities and identifying those lands where they can jointly operate and use their traditional ecological knowledge to recover those will help further our plan under America the Beautiful.
Thank you.
I had a quick follow-up question. So I really enjoyed your story about being with other spiritual leaders, and it touches on the crossover between traditional ecological knowledge and spirituality. So we were wondering, how do you find that balance between integrating it into science policy decisions and decision-making, but also respecting tribal privacy and thinking about differences across tribal communities?
You know, I think it just, for me, we all understand there is a force in all living things. There's a force in a plant. There's a force in all flora and fauna. There's even a force of living in rock, because rock was once alive before it froze itself up, but there's still energy in that rock. And so that type of spirituality of understanding what those life forces are, respecting those life forces regardless of your creed, your cultural background, can advance conservation movement to an understanding of how we better protect, preserve, and enhance all of those species so that they continue to be here for generations to come.
Beautiful. Well, I want to transition into a big subject now, and actually just talking to you a little bit about the land back movement and the experience of trying to re-empower Native communities to have a role in leading national parks and co-manage. Do you have any stories you can share about successful co-management?
So we do have a number of projects. We are, I can look at Yellowstone, where Superintendent Cam Shawley is working very closely with 27 different tribes on bringing in traditional ecological knowledge, bringing in cultural resources, being able to celebrate the folks that have been on the land for thousands of years, and how we can bring elders and young people back onto the landscape so they have a better understanding of what it takes to maintain those. We're working with the Seminole tribe down in Florida, working on the Everglades and figuring out how to restore those lands through cooperative agreements. Secretarial Order 3404 has really directed all of the bureaus within the Department of Interior to figure out how they can do tribal consultation and work on cooperative agreements. And co-management is a very specific legal term. And so it's one of the reasons I went to law school, because I wanted to understand all these legal terms and what's being used against me and how I can turn that around to use it to my advantage. And co-management, though, is a very strong legal term. It really does mean that the federal government gives up a portion of its power. And like any government, it's very worried about when it gives up a portion of its power. And so when you're doing that and looking at how we can co-manage, there are certain aspects in individual organic acts of how parks were set up that allow for that. And allows for co-management, how we're looking at how to expand that and looking at the legal ramifications of what that expansion looked like. But what we can do is we can do cooperative management rather than co-management. And through cooperative agreements, direct funding agreements, we can get at the same things and issues as that other legal term until we're able to figure out that more fully and work with Congress on it. But these other tools that we already have in our tool chest allows us to then build these partnerships, because we've been doing it with gateway communities for some time already. So we've been working with a number of gateway communities. It's being able to mirror those practices and work with tribes in a very similar way, in an equitable way. The difference is that working with a sovereign will bring additional resources that sometimes the park doesn't have and tribes possess. Not only do they possess the knowledge, but many times they also possess additional funding opportunities that they can bring to bear to help in recovery and restoration of both flora and fauna.
If I could just piggyback on that and bring it back to salmon. I don't know if you were involved with the Umatilla's work in bringing not only fish but water back to the Umatilla, which I think is a really successful example of what you're talking about, working with other stakeholders and local communities. Could you talk about that, or is that?
Umatilla Basin Project. So I wasn't involved, but Anton Minthorn, who really led that effort, Don Sampson, who's the current executive director of the tribe, led that effort also, really understanding that, water is life. And so, I think the toughest law course I ever took was water law. I got an A, but it's still very tough. And understanding that water law is practiced at the 100th meridian differently on the east side than it is on the west side. So I'm from the west side, first in use, first in right. So the tribes knew under federal law that as the first users of the water, they had senior rights. The states, though, the federal government has abrogated that power to states for whatever reason to be able to hand out water permitting. And the state of Oregon had over-permitted water throughout the Columbia River Basin, but in particular the Umatilla Basin that I'm from. And we looked long and hard in the 70s and early 80s whether we wanted to go to court or whether we wanted to partner. And we knew that it was, as they say, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. We didn't want to fight. And we would rather figure out how to work with the local irrigators on a bucket-by-bucket issue. So the main stem of the Columbia is a very strong and free-flowing river on the upper parts, but yet there's plenty of water that's been inundated by the dams. And so we worked with the irrigators to ensure that for every bucket of water that they left in the Umatilla River and its tributaries, they were able to draw a bucket of water for their agricultural products and use out of the main stem of the Columbia. That win-win approach then allowed us to then ensure that there was enough water, cool, clean water, so that we could restore salmon. When I was a child, my grandfather would take me up a place called Buckaroo and Esculpa Creek, and each spring we would wade on the water and we would build these weirs, these little dams. And I would ask him why. And he said, well, for when the salmon come, they're going to be tired on their return. So we build these weirs so that they can eddy out and work their way up. It wasn't until I was 14 in 1984 that I realized the salmon had been extinct on my river for almost 70 years. And yet we would continue to build the weirs. Each spring we would go for a walk and we'd build these little weirs. I'm saying, why are we doing this? And he goes, because the salmon will return. You just have to be patient. By the time the Umatilla Basin Act was enacted in 1988 and finally put in and implemented by 1994, by 1995 we saw the return of salmon for the first time back on the river. So his dream, his idea had come true. So even when they're not there, by practicing our traditions, understanding our responsibilities, and doing these little engineering projects, he was preparing me for that eventual return. Because he'd last seen them as a young boy when they became extinct on the river, but he knew in his heart that they would come back if we could just find a way to work cooperatively.
Thank you.
It's a beautiful story, and I have to say, Nansemond, my tribe's name, means fishing point. So all of these examples really resonate with me, and my last name's Bass. So I don't get tired of the fish examples. But thinking about you mentioned partnerships, and actually the space we're in right now is called Synacomica, and this is our densely inhabited area of tribal communities, and the capital of this area was Reconnecting, which is a site that we're actually working on developing a management plan for right now. And actually, you talked about it integrating youth into the planning process, and we have one of our ancestral interns in the audience right here. He'll be embarrassed, but Kaylin Anderson over here is working with the National Park Service. And I was wondering if you could share some thoughts for us here locally about when you're working with a site that has deep tribal meaning, it has meaning for our tribal leaders, and a lot of, we don't even know what is in the ground on that site. So as we plan a future vision for protecting its meaning for us and opening to public access, have you seen any other models where they've had to solve similar challenges and build community around a space that has multiple meanings?
Yes, and I think so we're also in the National Park Service responsible for the Native American Graves Repatriation Act. So under NAGPRO, we've worked very closely with tribes in repatriating those places, but also being able to help keep those areas private for protection because of the cultural resource. And that can be hard for the general public, but it's an understanding of protecting these ceremonial places, these culturally significant places that have both spiritual and religious meanings in order to ensure that that resource doesn't go away, because so many of them were destroyed. You know, I can think of on my own river, there were places of such power that had petroglyphs, that the petroglyphs were taken off the mountainside and put into museums. They still have their power, but they've lost it from the site from which they were born. And so being able to repatriate those back to those places, to be able to ensure that they're safely put back in those places, but most importantly, not to record it for the general public is extremely important too. I think that as we're looking at NAGPRA and the updates that are coming out, we want to ensure that tribes have the tools necessary to have those protections, and where they need to be modified and updated. But you know, that's also that we respect not only our own, but everybody else's religious practices and spirituality and how they wish to protect their cultures, and we want to be understanding of that too.
That's so powerful, and you know, we're all seeing how things develop right now, but I think, you know, just thinking about that is really hopeful for us. And another example I wanted to ask you about is in 2020, Congressman Donald McEachin proposed the Great Dismal Swamp National Heritage Area Act. And we've been really excited about that because there are only 2 NHAs in Virginia right now, and this one would present an opportunity to put a tribal community at the forefront, as well as the story of African American freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad. So we were wondering if you have any advice about how national heritage areas can help communities expand stewardship.
National heritage areas are truly a community-led effort. Our national heritage areas, where we provide training and technical assistance and opportunity without us having to manage the site, I think really underpins the importance of community partnerships. As I've traveled across the country and gone into, even before I became the National Park Service Director, when you go into these national heritage areas, you can see the intricacy and the partnerships that blossom between all multiple different partners, different communities, and being able to express their own places in culture. So I was just in Detroit and went through the number of national heritage areas, and whether that was we looked at the Freedom Trail for enslaved people coming up in and through Detroit into Canada, while we're also at the same time celebrating Motown and celebrating the Motor City as, you know, the car capital of the world of automotiveness. And I saw the diversity of there, but what I was most impressed with was how all these different partners with different ideas and different values and different aspects of their community could come together and work cooperatively with the Park Service, where we can provide some technical assistance to them so that they can be able to celebrate their culture and their heritage and their areas. And so I really think they're an extremely important component for the National Park Service to allow us to provide that training and technical assistance.
Wonderful. Yeah, I agree. And, you know, Rob touched on my last question a little bit earlier, but thinking about how to restore access to communities that haven't had as much access to spaces, and I think a national heritage area provides that opportunity for communities to reconnect, start telling stories. But do you have any other recommendations for reconnecting people to spaces when a lot of land and waters are privately owned or not accessible?
Well, at least for the public lands, that's what I think we're looking at that. We're trying to figure out how we ensure that access is equal to everyone, but also the people who have been excluded from that. You know, at Yosemite, we're celebrating the Asian American experience in Yosemite. They can actually see themselves, they reflect themselves and their own experience, including talking about some of the bad aspects of the Chinese Exclusion Act. We as Americans have never been afraid. We're very courageous, and we shouldn't be afraid of our past either. We should face it front on, understand it so that we don't repeat those mistakes again. We have an opportunity to learn that. We in the National Park Service do interpretation, but our job is not to lead you to a conclusion. Our job is to present the information and is from a historical standpoint and let you draw the conclusion. Now, the hope is that by presenting that, we are continue to be teachers, and you will learn from those past histories so that, again, we just don't repeat those mistakes.
If I could break in here, just a reminder, if you do have questions, please write them on the cards. Katie and Matt are going to walk through the aisles, so pass them to one of these center aisles, and they'll collect them if you want to pose a question.
I'd like to pick up there on the issue of diversity, and also the larger issue of education and careers. We have a lot of students here tonight, including some from my American West class, who of course knew all about prior appropriation before you brought it up, right? Yeah, okay, thanks. But could you speak about, I have a couple questions on this issue, but what the IIC and William & Mary generally should be doing to support diversity in national parks and in management of public lands generally, in terms of training our students?
You know, is giving them that solid education. A liberal arts education, I think, is extremely important because it teaches critical thinking. And what we want in the national parks is a workforce that is a critical thinking workforce. In my travels, in the short 5 months that I've been here, I've been consistently impressed by the staff's dedication to the mission. And that we are not training, while they are the green and gray, they are critical thinkers. They bring new ideas. They're not scared to bring those new ideas to the forefront, to their superintendents, to their colleagues. And I think that colleges can help with that through liberal arts degrees of making that critical thinker, making them challenge themselves on what they thought were the norms, and we come up with new norms. But more importantly is when they go into the workforce to bring those skill sets. And whether you're working interpretation, cultural resources, management, business practices, those are all important aspects to being able to understand your place, but also to be a contributor and understand how that contribution can mean to the workforce and to the parks themselves.
Great. What advice do you have for youth? And I know there's at least one person here in this camp interested in pursuing careers in the National Park Service or in conservation within the federal system.
You know, so we have a number of cooperative operations, but we also have a number of internships, and we do seasonal hiring, which is in full force. There's a great opportunity for you to put on your boots, to get outside and find that out. Also to work in different internship opportunities throughout the service. So if you're interested in business practices and you're interested in concessionaires, if you're interested in finance, if you're interested in interpretation, there are a lot of opportunities that are offered for folks to see if they really want to join the service. And our sister agencies do that too. Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so being able to take advantage of those, I think what folks need to just understand is that it's going to be hard work. You're going to be asked to do a lot, but in return, I think the work that you do and the educational experience you get will be quite rewarding.
Thank you.
And don't be scared to take a chance. That's the biggest thing. I think to myself, as Skookum is my entire career. It has been not linear in any way, but I had enough mentors and were able to come my own fears to take chances on things I would have never thought I could do. So look for your mentors out there and ask them to help.
I want to ask a bit of a follow-up question on a group of stakeholders that, I don't know if they report to you or you report to them, but the community of employees of the National Park Service. What has their response been to your new approach and your new ideas of the way the National Park Service and the National Park System should conserve or be stewards moving forward, and the ideas of bringing traditional ecological indigenous knowledge into the National Park Service? How have they responded to those approaches, and have there been challenges bringing new ideas?
That value system already existed because it exists in the Organic Act that we are to preserve these places. So being the initiatives that I laid out are not much different. It's just bringing additional resources to them. I really see myself as the director of the National Park Service responsible for ensuring that the staff have the resources necessary in order to accomplish the mission of their job. We are very fortunate, as I said, to have the Great American Outdoors Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The Great American Outdoors Act is bringing us $1.9 billion a year to really get back at infrastructure and deferred maintenance that we haven't been able to get to in decades, sometimes 70 years of use that needs really to be upgraded. That's all great, but the part that we were missing is in our baseline budgeting. And so talking to appropriators, talking to our committees of jurisdiction with Congress about that we really need more staff people on the ground. 10 years, we're down 3,200 to 3,400 staff members from where we were 10 years ago. But our national parks are seeing an increase of 20% more Americans coming into the parks and visitors than we've ever seen before. Some parks as much as 130%. And so that is taking a strain on the staff. That is a stress on the staff. It's a stress on the system itself. And while both GOA and Bill will help us in some of that infrastructure stuff, what we need to be able to do is put more boots on the ground to help integrate those things and actually to do that project work. So the staff, when I talk to them, and I've laid out my overall conservation vision, I think it's been taken over very well. Many of them are working, we're already working on them. This is just a way to enhance it. We have additional resources by bringing in traditional ecological knowledge from tribes who want to participate with us. But my job is really to go out and get more funding to ensure that they can do the work that they've been charged to do, and the American people expect them to do. The American people expect to be able to go into their parks and to enjoy themselves. And they're absolutely right, they should. But we can only do that if we have people who are actually helping maintain those parks and provide the experience that Americans expect.
And you mentioned the significant increase in visitorship to the national parks, and I think it's only grown in the past few years with COVID, with people wanting to get outdoors. And for a lot of people that want to be in nature and want to experience nature, sometimes that could take away from the experience. So how do you find that balance between increasing visitorship, opening up more opportunities for people to connect to nature, but still providing that sense of being out somewhere quiet and somewhere peaceful?
Well, we have, the larger, we have 424 national parks, monuments, memorials, and 60 of them really get the bulk of all of that. And what I want and what I'm hoping to do, last week was National Park Week, and I wanted to highlight national heritage areas and the smaller parks. So by example, when I was in Ohio, I was very impressed whether that was going to look at the Ohio Mountains, whether that was to look at Colonel Charles Young's home, to go to President Taft's house. Basically, you could stay in Columbus or Dayton for 4 or 5 days as a family and hit 5 to 6 national parks. Or you could go to one of the big parks. I'm not saying you shouldn't, that the iconic parks are great. But the diversity of experience that Americans are missing out on by seeing some of our smaller parks is a huge missed opportunity. And I want to bring more attention to that, which would help alleviate some of the issues of overcrowding in some of the other parks, but give people a mixture of both an urban opportunity and a rural opportunity to get out onto the landscape. We just need to be able to market that a little bit better. Going into national heritage areas, again, the diversity that the national heritage areas offer an experience for our fellow Americans and our international travels are extremely important. But we just need to be better at marketing those opportunities.
And maybe since it was National Park Week, maybe you don't want to answer this question, but do you have a favorite national park?
Normally I say the one I'm in at the moment. Grand Tetons will always be. So, and the only reason Grand Tetons is because my wife was a concessionaire there. So, but it was also the first large park that we took my children, and they fell in love with just waking up every morning and looking out onto the Grand Tetons.
That's spectacular.
Being able to wade out into the lake. My kids were already outdoor kids, but they really still harken back to when they were little and got to go to Grand Tetons.
Excellent. Excellent. Any other follow-ups? We do have some questions from the audience.
I guess I have one more. This is an event sponsored by the Institute for Integrative Conservation, and so it's a lot about conservation, but I am a historian by training. So I had a question. You touched on it earlier, but the opportunities and challenges around interpreting Native American history in the national parks and monuments, they've not been well represented, and the darker history of Native people being expelled or excluded from parks. And then there's a lot of controversies around places like Little Bighorn. And not many Native people have been employees of the Park Service for the most part. I think, is it Gerard Baker? The man? Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you could talk about that aspect of your job.
I've been impressed. I think the narrative that Parks have been saying has changed dramatically over the last 15 to 20 years. I think more of that story is coming out, but it's not going to be a quick process. What I found is that national parks are extremely dedicated people. They're very smart, but they're also very academic. And so they want to prove, they want the information there, they do the research, they do their homework, and they do it very well. And we work at the speed of government. So that's not always the quickest, but that's the best way to ensure that we are bringing in those different voices and those tribal voices. I mean, I look at, by example, the work, and I'll use Superintendent Shawley again, working with 27 different tribes who have 27 different stories of how they interact with Yellowstone. how do you deal with that? He's been very patient with it. He's worked with his staff. They're taking the time to bring those different stories in, and he's not picking one story over another. He's making sure that there is enough room that everybody's story can be told, and it's going to be told a little differently. Diversity is natural. I'm going to say it again. Diversity is natural. You look around you in any place on the earth, and diversity is natural. The only people that make it unnatural are human beings. We catalog, we categorize, we separate, we put those things apart. But the harder we try to do that, the more nature is going to force us to put it together. And so our job in National Park Service is to celebrate that diversity, not just with the flora and fauna, but the human experience on the landscape. We are obligated to ensure that we form a more perfect union, and the only way we can form that more perfect union is by allowing the tribes and other people to tell their stories within the park system. I am very proud of the National Park Service staff and seeing that they're very open to that. They're open to those discussions. But we do have to have some patience because they're very good at what they do, because they do the research and they don't wish to offend anyone. Much different than it was 25, 30 years ago. You know, I began my search around national parks 33 years ago, just in Virginia Beach. As a young sailor, we were in a hurry. We had 2 weeks before classes, in between classes, late spring. A buddy of mine was going to get married, so five of us all ran to Maine, drove up there, got him married, dropped him off, sent him on his honeymoon, and then the rest of us, because young sailors who are enlisted don't have a lot of money, we decided that we would visit as many national parks from Maine to northern Florida and then drive back to Virginia. That experience really opened my eyes because I saw the passion within the rangers who were telling these stories. But more importantly, it put me in the footsteps of the tribal people of Virginia, the tribal people of Maine, my fellow Americans who fought in the Revolutionary War, walk in the footsteps of both northern and southern soldiers, and feeling that that energy still is on these battle places. It really helps set the foundation of what it means to be American. But what I was most impressed with was the stories that rangers could tell with passion and with integrity. And so I know that while it's been slow to change, because diversity is natural, it will overcome that. And eventually we will be able to tell more American stories within our park system. So it reflects who we are as a diverse nation.
Thank you. Do we have some questions from the audience? Now they get tough.
Okay. Thank you, first of all, for your time and for coming here tonight. The first question that we have is, what makes you hopeful for a more just or equitable future?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
What makes you hopeful for a more just or equitable future?
What makes me hopeful? Our Constitution, our form of government, our way of life as Americans is an experiment, which means that we're going to face those challenges. We're going to have successes, we're going to have failures, but we don't give up on the experiment. And so I am hopeful that as long as we as Americans continue to dig in and deal with our challenges, understanding our past, learning to not repeat those mistakes, makes me hopeful. It's not easy, and our experiment is not easy. Because we want to welcome in that diversity, we want to bring multiple voices to the table. We want to ensure that we have free speech. We want to ensure that people have a right to pursue liberty and happiness. So I think the experiment itself is what makes me think that it's hopeful.
Again, I would like to reiterate my gratitude for you joining us this evening. The question is, there's a difference between collaboration and consultation. Can you give an example of U.S. tribal interactions with each of these?
Yes. So collaborative efforts are things that we've already mutually agreed upon that we want to do together. And so when we worked with my own tribe, when we worked with the federal government on the Umatilla Basin project and working with the federal agencies, is that they already wanted to know that they recognized the tribes already had a right, but they also recognized the junior rights of the non-Indians water holders. So we collaborated together to come up with a plan to present to the non-Indian water holders. That was a collaborative. Consultation happens at the forefront of that. So even before you get to the collaborative portion of it, you have to have consultation, which means you have to meet as equals in government and have a discussion about the good, bad, and the ugly. And usually when I've done it as a tribal leader, when I was working for my tribe and we did consultation, we would want to say, we need to also talk about what's ugly. And that's not what we're going to do. What's bad, this is what we need to change, and let's concentrate on the good. But that's all in the negotiating stage. By the time you got to collaboration, you've already worked all of those consultation issues out and you're actually implementing a project.
Thank you. And just to follow up, the person who wrote the question also asked, I found it very interesting when you said non-Indian, because I haven't heard that used before, but I understand that the reframing to center Indigenous experiences, excuse me, how has the language around parks and tribal land sovereignty changed? How does it need to change?
I think that what I've seen is there's the recognition that tribes have rights within the park system themselves. For so long, the national parks were seen, and they are, these iconic landmarks that are really talk about protection, and staff have done a very good at protecting those parks in a way, which means is to not necessarily have the influence of local communities. We've since learned that it's important to bring those local communities in because they're what's going to sustain our parks and help us to grow. But now it's bringing on tribes into that same idea of how we bring them in partnership and recognizing that tribes do have rights within those parks. And those rights supersede the Constitution of the United States and the Organic Act of 1916. That's a different way of thinking. That's a different way of understanding the law. And so we haven't always had solicitors who have been there who would agree with that. But they've learned over time we can either figure out how to work in partnership or we can end up in court. Generally, the courts aren't always favorable to tribes, but when it comes down to treaty rights, they normally will recognize a treaty right supersedes a federal law if it's already in the treaty. And many treaties, like my own, says I have a right to my usual custom places to hunt, fish, and gather on lands held in common with citizens of the United States. It's pretty clear. It means I can hunt, fish, and gather on all federal lands. Does that mean on national parks? On some, yes, it does. On some of those are refuges. And some, we're going to challenge that, and tribes have challenged it, or they've worked cooperatively. So by example, my tribe, when we returned to Buffalo back in 2011, rather than hunt on Yellowstone, we worked with Yellowstone National Park, we worked with Gallatin Forest and the forest supervisor there to wait until the buffalo in the wintertime came off the park and we would hunt in the national forest so that we wouldn't ruin any experience for any other Americans on the park itself. That was both a consultation discussion and a collaborative agreement so that we could return to Buffalo once again.
Thank you.
Next question that we have is, how do you balance respect for sacred sites and parks with other activities that might disrespect or damage those sites, like rock climbing or just general recreation in the areas?
You know, it's going to come with some understanding and more education. And, you know, I don't wish to take away from those experiences for people who recreate differently, but I also want to be sure that we are not offending anybody else in that space. And so, if there are areas that are of sacred nature, we need to be able to figure out how to work with tribes to be able to educate other folks on what that means for them and why they use that space in that way so that there isn't a negative interaction in that, and places that may be more appropriate in which we can do rock climbing. I know that people sometimes don't like that because they'll say, I've always came here. What's always mean? In your generation, because like when I say always, I'm talking 1,000 generations. And so there's a different option of time and figuring out what that means and figuring out how people interacted with those spaces. But, you know, I think there's a lot has to do around educating folks and providing them that information so that they can use critical learning skills to make good decisions.
Thank you.
We have a question from the online audience as well. How can we further work to amplify the voices of natives in environmental activism conversations? What steps can we take as students?
Get an education. Use your education not as a weapon, but as a place of power and understanding. And that can be hard in activism. My big sister is Winona LaDuke, and the work that she does is outstanding. But her and I have a different way of doing it, but both are extremely important in how we do our work, and I respect how she does it. You know, I'm not the guy who's going to go out there and chain himself to something. I want to figure out how to work from the inside. But the people who do that type of radical is also important. It's important for them to be able to express themselves in a way that they're looking to get justice and understanding. So you have to have all those ways to bring attention to an issue. I understand that. And I wouldn't degrade any of those issues. But there's, that's some bravery and courage unto itself, because you also must suffer the consequences of whatever the law is at the time.
Thank you.
I think this may kind of play into the same line of discussion, but what role can people without conservation backgrounds play in supporting Native communities through conservation?
I think whether people recognize it or not, they're all conservationists. One, first and foremost, is that, over 70% of our body is made of water. Water is the single most important thing to us as a human being in ingestion. And so you'll become a conservationist pretty fast if A, your water is dirty, or B, your water doesn't come out of your tap. So people saying they're not conservationists, they are in some way. They want to be able to conserve and protect those things that are going to give them what they need. What I know as a human being is I have, granted I went to business school, so I understand from a business perspective that I have unlimited wants with limited resources, but that's not how I was brought up. I was brought up that I have limited wants with unlimited resources. That being said, my resources is I want air, I want water, I want food, I want shelter, and I want heat. That's all I need to not survive, but to thrive on the landscape. So when you look at those elements, one important, air, water, and land to live on, you want to be able to have those resources. Those resources make you a conservationist because you want to have clean air, you want to have clean water, and you want to ensure the ground that you live on isn't poisoned. And I don't care if you live in an urban area in an apartment, like I currently do, or you live in the backwoods in a rural area. So people who don't see themselves as conservationists are still inside themselves, I think, need to understand their relationship with the natural world and how important it plays in order for them to be a healthy being.
Thank you.
Another question from the online audience. What do you see as the role of archaeology within the National Park Service in terms of Indigenous sovereignty?
Archaeology. So archaeology can tell a tale, and I think it's important. It's a strong science that can help us better define who we are, but it needs to be done in partnership with tribes when you are digging up their artifacts, when you are digging up their ancestors. I worked on the Kennewick Man, and I worked very hard on the Kennewick Man with my tribes. We really pushed that we didn't want to do DNA testing on the Kennewick Man. We didn't need the federal government and the archaeologists and anthropologists to tell us he was one of us. We already knew he was one of us. For those who don't know who that is, we also call him the Ancient One. In 1995, along the Columbia River in Kennewick, Washington, a body was found and exhumed. His body was over 9,000 years old. The tribes laid claim to him under the Native American Graves Repatriation Act that we wanted to rebury him and repatriate him back into the ground. We were fought by Western science. We were fought by a number of anthropologists and archaeologists who really wanted to do a study on them. Great, you can study on your own people, but we know that our people, when you passed, are supposed to be laying in the ground, and that's where they belong, because that's where they were buried, and that is something that is important to us. We lost in court over and over again because they kept saying we couldn't make a positive identification that he came from our people. Eventually, we were able to do a DNA testing, and it was done in, is it Copenhagen? I'm trying to remember. It was done in Europe, and it was 99.8% proof that he followed from the lineage of the Plateau people. And even then, we were still getting pushback about whether we could get permission to rebury him. And eventually, we ended up having to go to Congress and do a workaround under the WERDA bill in order to have him reburied. But we shouldn't have had to have done that in the first place. And so what we're looking at are some fixes under the Native American Graves Repatriation Act that will have a much more stronger understanding of that cultural affiliation to a tribal member, to tribes, so that they can work on those issues. But it isn't to say that archaeology doesn't have an important role. It absolutely does. But it needs to be done in partnership and consultation with tribes when we have inadvertent finds or direct finds and discoveries, so that tribes, tribal historic preservation officers, their own scientific staff can work in cooperation with archaeologists and anthropologists on how to best interpret that information.
Thank you. And then finally from online, listener is asking, what does it look like to bring opportunities for reciprocity/engagement with nature to urban areas, especially in historically dispossessed communities?
That's a good one. So when I worked in New York City, I did a number of environmental programming throughout the 5 boroughs. And to my surprise were how many creeks and streams still run through Manhattan and the other boroughs that are only partially daylighted, and people not understanding that they already have a reciprocity connection to those waterways. So how you flush your toilet, what you flush down your toilet, what you put down your water drain, what you throw on the ground is how that is going to, how that city in that urban area is going to also treat you. And so we see a lot of sickness and illness in urban areas because of how fast disease spreads when we're not taking care of that environment. And so for, I say, in urban dwellers, and when I was working with young people throughout New York City, I would remind them that the better you take care of your home and don't disrespect these things will ensure that these chemicals and hairspray and all those other things don't end up necessarily into the water system that we are so reliant upon, because they were surprised about where their water system actually came from and how it was treated, you know, from the Bronx River and from the East River, not recognizing that, yes, when you disrespect the landscape around you, that will have a direct reaction on the things that you intake into your body.
Thank you.
The final question that we have is, looking back with what you know today, what advice would you give your 19-year-old self?
I'm sorry, say that again?
What advice would you give to your 19-year-old self?
To my 19-year-old self? Don't be so quick to want to experience war. I should have listened to my father and my uncle and my great uncles and my grandfather, who all had experienced war before I had. That's what advice I'd give. Just keep that innocence as long as possible. I'm working very hard with all of my children now for them to, they've talked about joining the military, and I want them to think that really through before they do it. It's an honorable thing, but they may end up having to go and fight and hurt somebody else, and I don't wish that on anyone.
Thank you so much for taking the time to answer all these questions.
Thank you.
I'm going to, before we close, do you have any more questions? I have one more question.
I have too many questions. I mean, this has just been an incredible conversation.
No, please go ahead, one more.
Oh, no, go, you go.
Well, I want to ask, so you've had a career in conservation, and I know I've worked for an NGO for many years, and I know how amazing the work can be, and I also know how challenging the work can be, and how frustrating and exhausting it can be mentally and physically. So as a career conservationist, how do you deal with some of those challenges, and how do you stay hopeful about conservation moving forward, and what do we leave with in terms of feeling hopeful about the planet and the natural areas?
For me, it's, I think, and we saw this during the pandemic, it's getting out into your natural world. So I center myself, and I'm already looking forward to returning back to the Big River and trying to figure out when I can join my sister to fish on the Big River, and reconnecting to the water and touching water, pulling the first salmon out of the river itself, breathing the fresh air of the Pacific Northwest as the Chinook winds blows down the Columbia River. Those are the things that remind me of why I do the work I do, or why I'm supposed to be there, and to understand and accept those challenges and be able to rejuvenate and go back into doing a good fight.
Excellent. Nikki, do you want to have the final question?
I don't know. I guess one thought that's been on my mind is, you know, thinking about ways, in our community, we're thinking about developing job opportunities for our youth and building skill sets that are competitive and meaningful. And so I just wonder if you have any last thoughts for working at the tribal level to get your youth into conservation careers, and, you know, ways to use that. I mean, we look at opportunities for economic development, but to me, this is like an educational development and a way to have a career that's meaningful culturally, spiritually, and at a community level.
You know, if you want to make radical change in Indian country, you don't do it with your youth, you do it with your elders. Elders make radical change. And the reason that happens is because of their life experience. And so I would go to my elders and ask them, how can we make that foundation possible? What are the things from our cultural belief systems that are most critical for our youth to understand, and how can we teach them? And what new skills do we need to bring forward that you want them to learn that will make us prosperous, but prosperous in a balanced way? And so my advice would be to talk to your elders and figure that out, how you want to make radical change.
I love that. I actually have taught some of our elders to use drones and you know, work with them to study our land and kind of integrate those perspectives. So I love that advice, and I want to keep practicing it.
Very good.
Well, I'd like to take a moment to thank Director Sams for coming all this way to join us for this amazing discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. It was an honor.
And I want to thank Nikki Bass and Andrew Fisher for moderating and asking all the wonderful questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Also, I want to thank all of you for joining us. I know it got a little cold out here, but that's what we get for being in nature, and it should be refreshing. We really appreciate you being a part of the integrative conservation community here at William & Mary. I want to thank the National Park Service and to our partners, the William & Mary Center for Racial and Social Justice, American Indian Resource Center, American Indian Student Association, Native Studies Minor, the Environment and Sustainability Program, and Departments of History and Anthropology for helping to make this event happen. And finally, I want to thank the incredible IIC team, the staff, the students, and in particular, Anita Hagee-Ferguson, who have worked tirelessly to bring this event together. Thank you so much. If you'd like to find out more about the Institute for Integrative Conservation and our upcoming events, please sign up for our listserv. You could just visit our website at www.wm.edu/conservation. Visit the National Park Service website to find some of the smaller parks to visit and
Download our app.
get out in nature. Thank you so much for being here. Please do get home safely and watch out for wildlife on the roads. There's a lot of it around here.
Yes, squirrel is supposed to
Did it?
I gotta eat too.
They're allowed.